Mayor.
Yes, we can hear you.
I can hear you.
All right, great. We'll go ahead and get started. And do we start with a roll call, Omar? Will you do that, or is Terry present?
No, I'm here. I'll do the roll.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay. Councilmember Brightigan,
Here.
Councilmember O'Neill,
Here.
Councilmember Bowie, Councilmember Klopfenstein, Councilmember Kim Wynn,
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Deidre Wynn,
Here.
Mayor Jones.
Here. I'd like to just note for the record that Councilmember Klopfenstein contacted me, and unfortunately she had a death in the family, so she's not going to be attending tonight. Do we know if Fat is going to join us? Have we heard from him?
He hasn't contacted the city clerk's office.
Okay. Scott, if you're there, could you maybe reach out to him and see if he's going to join?
Sure, Mayor. Yeah, I assume he'll be joining us shortly.
Okay. Should we wait or should we go ahead and get started?
I would say maybe we get started and I think he'll be joining us shortly.
Okay. Sounds good. With that, what's next? Do we do,
We do oral communications.
yeah, okay. Omar, did you want me to hand that over to you to do the oral communications? Is that what you had said earlier, or do you want me to just go ahead and open it?
No, just open it and city clerk can help us.
Got it. Okay, so we'll go on to oral communications. Madam Clerk, do we have any speakers?
We have one speaker in the audience.
Great.
Good evening, City Council, Mr. Mayor. I was looking for the Measure O meeting that was supposed to happen tonight. According to their verbal minutes, there's no actual minutes posted on the website since October 4th. But it's kind of like this, somebody calls a meeting on Thursday or Monday. So anyway, I just want to say how seriously I object to the city that I've lived in and paid taxes for the past 17 years, and even thinking about floating pension obligation bonds. If you look at the Measure O, it seems to me from the PowerPoints, I haven't got the data, but about 50%, at least 50% of the allocated funds for Measure O has gone towards pensions also. I could be wrong. I'll have to get the line for line stuff, but based on the 2 years in the Measure O, the thing that's the latest is 2019, 2020. There's nothing that has the 2021. So anyway, I just wanted to voice I just think the city needs to figure it out. This chart looks very close to the 2018. Actually, it looks a little bit better than the 2018 study that the city council asked to be done on the amount of dollars, total dollars going to pension versus the total payroll. This is actually a little bit less, maybe $5 million a year in the peak before the PEPRA kicks in. So anyway, I just wanted to say I think the city and the city council and the city manager need to sit down and figure out how to not dip into my pocketbook anymore. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Madam Clerk, do we have any others present?
We have no one else in the audience wishing to speak, and we do not have any callers coming in on the website.
Okay. With that, we'll go ahead and close oral communications, and then I'll hand it over to General Counsel.
Mr. Mayor, this is City Manager Scott Stiles. I know you said you were going to hand it over to General Counsel, but unless our city attorney had anything to say, I think I can do the introduction for the presentation here tonight, if you're ready for that.
Yeah, please go ahead, Scott. Thanks.
Okay, very good. Well, Mayor, council members, thank you for taking a little bit of time to review this presentation with us this evening. Also, thanks to any of the members of the public that are listening in. The issue of all cities' pension obligations are significant. We've all read about it. We've all known about it. I know many of the council members, you've taken some time to do some education around this issue of pension obligation bonds. It's something that we're starting to see more and more cities undergo the process of going down this path. Number of cities in Orange County, number of cities in California, and given some of the economic climate and other things, we felt it was maybe time for us to have a discussion with council about that. As you know, and as the prior speaker referenced, we were thrilled to have Standard & Poor's give us a 2-notch rating increase this year, which you don't hear about very often. So we're very proud of the fact that council members, you've been very diligent in working with us on our reserve fund policy and other strategies to help us kind of manage our pension obligations. And this is something that we think merits some consideration for furthering, for giving us ability for long-term positioning for our city's financial situation down the road. And so what we wanted to talk a little bit about this more in depth with you. There won't be any decisions that any council members need to make tonight. We would probably be having another discussion about this at the next council meeting, just about doing some of the research that's needed to go down this road. Of course, this process takes several weeks and takes a lot of time. So this is just a beginning stage for us to kind of just talk about it. I want to let you know that we have 3 of our financial consultants with us this evening. Sarah Brown is an underwriter with Stifel, who will be going through most of the presentation with us. Also with us is Anna Sarabian from Fieldman Rollap. Fieldman Rollap is our financial advisor for the city of Garden Grove, and we work closely with them. Also with us is Brian Forbath with Stradling, who is our bond counsel. And, I know there's questions about that you might have for him, should they come up at the end of the presentation today. So what I think what we'll do is we want to have Sarah, put up on the screen. She's going to walk us through some of the pension obligation bond 101 presentation. It's a complicated subject, and we tried to put something together that we think will be helpful to our community to understand this a little better. And I know Anna will be weighing in a little bit, and then of course any questions for Brian as our bond counsel. He's available on this panel discussion as well. So I think with that, I will also turn this over for a brief comment or two from our finance director, Patricia Song, who I think might want to say a couple words.
Sure. Thank you, Scott. Good evening, everyone. As Scott mentioned, we will be talking about a pension obligation bonds and the feasibility of issuing such with the goal to save money for the city over the next 20 plus years. As you might be aware that over the past 3 years, the municipal bond market has been very active, especially for pension obligation bonds. Close to 40 California cities had issued these bonds, and in Orange County alone, 5 cities issued them in late 2020 throughout the entire 2021. Because of the favorable market condition and historically low borrowing rate, as well as what Scott mentioned, that we had a significant increase in our credit rating, the time seems to be perfect for us to consider this approach to finance our, over $300 million pension debt. Sarah from Stifel will be giving you a presentation detailing a lot of the analysis that we've been doing in the past couple of months to introduce this concept to you and the public and obtain, we're just seeking for your direction on moving forward. So Sarah, with that, I'd like to turn it to you.
Great, thank you. Hopefully you can see on the screen some presentation slides, and I will start with I guess I should start with thanking you for taking the time and out of a Monday evening to listen to this. And I will then move on to the overwhelmingly positive news, which Patricia referenced, as well as Mr. Stiles, and that is that the city's credit fundamentals are very, very strong, showing extraordinary improvement in recent years. That's reflective of the sales tax measure, and it's very much reflective of the policies and practices that City Council has adopted, and that management of the city has put in place to build reserves and establish policies that can maintain those reserves even through volatile economic conditions. Standard & Poor's, which is one of the three main rating agencies that rate municipalities and municipal debt, acknowledged this recently with the 2-notch upgrade in the city's credit rating. That is, wouldn't say unprecedented, but it doesn't happen very often that a rating agency would make a 2-notch move in a rating analysis. That puts the city's issuer credit rating at AA+, which is the second highest rating possible for a city like Garden Grove. So I guess a good question to ask then is what really is Standard & Poor's looking at when they make that rating assessment? Says S&P, Standard & Poor's, really implemented its current criteria in 2013. The rating agency starts with quantitative framework that assigns a weight to 7 different factors. The result is what they call an indicative rating, which then the rating agency adjusts either upward or downward based on a variety of overarching themes, trends, challenges. The factors that the rating agency starts with include the economy, which gets the largest weighting of the 7 at 30%, the financial management and governance environment at 20%, budgetary performance, budgetary flexibility, liquidity, and debt and contingent liabilities each get 10%. And then finally, there's what's called the institutional framework, which really measures the legal and practical environment that the local government operates within. There's really not a lot you can do with that. All cities in California, really all governments of the same type in the same state receive the same assessment for that factor. So when S&P looks at these, they start with a variety of mostly quantitative measures, like the economy is based on per capita market value and median household income as a percentage of national average. Debt and contingent liabilities would look at debt service as a share of expenditures, so on for each of these 7 factors. And based on where the municipality comes out on that, S&P attaches an assessment of either very strong, adequate, weak, or very weak to each of these factors. And so the rating analysis that Standard & Poor's released back in September rates the city as very strong in the areas of financial management, liquidity, budget flexibility and debt and contingent liabilities, and as strong in the factors of economy and budgetary performance. There was, however, concern expressed throughout the report about the city's very large pension liability. And in fact, S&P noted that in its analysis that there is a long-term risk related to the magnitude of the city's unfunded pension liability. Move on to the next slide here. So let's talk a little bit about what the pension liability is. In basic terms, the pension liability is the future liability resulting from pension committee commitments that the city has made to its current and past employees. It's the promise to pay benefits, and therefore the unfunded liability is when the market value of assets that have been put aside for that purpose is less than what the expected cost of those benefits are. You know, like obviously the city, like most cities in California, allows CalPERS to manage its pension benefit payments and the investment of money that has been put aside to address those payments. So in each year, there are essentially two types of payments that the city makes to CalPERS. First is the normal cost, which for fiscal year 2023 is estimated at about 13 million. And the second, the normal cost, that represents the annual cost of service accrual for the upcoming fiscal year for active employees. This is the second one, and the far larger component is the unfunded accrued liability, or UAL amortization. And as shown here, for fiscal year 2023, the payment is estimated at about 27.6 million. So you know, twice as amount of the normal cost. This is the amortized dollar amount that CalPERS estimates is needed to fund past service credits earned for members who are currently receiving benefits, active members, and members entitled to deferred benefits as of a particular valuation date. The city's UAL and therefore the annual amortization of the unfunded liability has grown tremendously over the last 10 years. You can see this in the graph that in 2010, the UAL was estimated at approximately $106 million. And 10 years later, that UAL has grown to approximately $329 million. That's as of the June 30, 2020 valuation date. The UAL increases for a variety of reasons. It increases whenever CalPERS does not meet its targeted investment rate, which right now was just changed from 7% to 6.8%. That's also referred to as the discount rate. It also increases when more benefits are promised to active employees. And it also increases when it's determined that people are living longer. It declines, you know, on the flip side, it will decline if CalPERS earns a level above the discount rate. So again, you know, as an example, in the past fiscal year that ended June 30th, 2021, the discount rate was 7%, but CalPERS earned 21%. So that results in a decrease of the city's UAL. But all of these combine over time to create an amortization. And I'll show you what the city's looks like here on this slide. CalPERS, this amortization annual amortization essentially functions like a debt service schedule. It's what would be required to be paid by the city to CalPERS in each year through 2044 in order to pay off the UAL. If CalPERS achieves exactly in this case, 7% discount rate, which is when this was calculated every year through that 2044 time period, and the city made exactly those payments, at the end of that time, the city would have a zero unfunded liability. That's holding, of course, everything constant in terms of benefits and mortality rates. So I'm going to move on to talk a little bit about the landscape in California. The fact that the city's pension liability or unfunded liability has grown in the city's case 3 times over the past 10 years is not unusual among cities in California. Many cities, counties, and special districts have faced or are currently facing the same challenges as the city is. And many of those have decided to put in place a pension cost management strategy that includes selling pension bonds, in addition to putting aside monies into reserves and Section 115 trusts. In fact, over the past 3 years, California cities, counties, and special districts have sold more than $6.9 billion of pension bonds, and those have ranged in size from $5 million to $720 million. And as you can see here in this slide, which shows some of the larger pension financings that have occurred over that time period, the public agencies have had ratings anywhere from AAA to BBB plus. As Scott mentioned earlier in his introduction, other Orange County cities have sold pension bonds, including as shown here, the city of Orange, Santa Ana, Huntington Beach, we've got Placentia. So we're just showing the variety of issuers that have come to market. And you can see there the interest rates that those issuers have been able to achieve in the financial markets. I'm just picking the one at the top of the list, Poway, which sold bonds in December of 2021. Their bond issue had a final maturity in 2048 and what's called a TIC, and just to explain a little bit about that, that's considered the true interest cost. That's what TIC stands for, the true interest cost, which is the estimated borrowing rate, or the borrowing rate that's achieved when you factor in the cost of borrowing, the interest rates, as well as the cost of issuance in bringing the bond issue to market. So in the case of Poway, the 2.82% was the all-in true interest cost of that borrowing. That compares again with a discount rate now of 6.8% that CalPERS effectively charges cities and members of the CalPERS pension plan. So what is a pension bond? It's essentially a loan to pay off the debt to CalPERS. Instead of owing $329 million to CalPERS, the city would owe $329 million to investors. The benefit, why are you doing? You're changing one kind of debt into another kind of debt. The benefit is that the issuer of the pension bonds pays a rate to investors that is below the discount rate that is charged by CalPERS. It is important to point out that once a pension bond is issued, the money that is raised gets transferred to CalPERS, but that's not the end of the story. CalPERS is charged with investing the money and to keep up with the current discount rate. If CalPERS does not meet the target, a new amortization basis is created and would start to accrue. On the flip side, if CalPERS exceeds its target, the city will actually have more asset value than it does have pension liability. We'll cover this again in a few more slides, but I just wanted to introduce the topic here. Oops, sorry. There are many ways that a pension bond debt service can be structured to meet different goals of the public agency. And I thought perhaps the best way to illustrate that is to show what other cities have done. So I've got a few different examples here, and I'll start with, sorry.
Mommy.
Okay. Yeah.
Mommy.
Yeah, sorry.
I want to be ready for my next birthday. I will
Okay.
go to a movie for
Okay,
my
okay.
birthday.
Jasper, please take it. Sorry, I'm so sorry. So probably the most common structure is the one that is represented here on the top with the city of Whittier. And as you can see, the gray line represents the CalPERS amortization schedule, very similar to the city of Garden Grove. That amortization schedule has a steep incline up to about 2032 and then begins to decline. And so Whittier chose to level out their payments for the unfunded liability and take some amount of cash flow savings. So the difference between the gray line and the blue debt service schedule represents cash flow savings. Whittier combined this with the passage of a pension cost management policy that directed a share of these cash flow savings into different reserves, including increasing an amount to the Section 115 trust. The next one, Chula Vista, was looking to create a moderately escalating debt service schedule to mirror some historical increases in their revenues. So again, they too combine this with a pension cost management strategy that included very specific amounts of that savings to be directed to different types of reserves. City of Santa Ana was one that chose not to refinance the entire pension liability, and instead they chose to amortize the portion of it that had the longest term, which gets them the most overall savings. They also have the opportunity over time to go back and sell additional pension bonds if they so choose. Finally, I think the last one I wanted to show was the city of Corona. Like Garden Grove, Corona had passed a sales tax measure right before the pandemic. They were comfortable with the level of payments that they were scheduled to pay, but they wanted to use the savings, the interest cost savings, by paying off their pension liability, in this case, 10 years earlier. So keeping their payments roughly the same, they will be paying off their pension liability by 2034 rather than the scheduled 44 under the CalPERS amortization schedule. So I'm going to turn it over to Anna to talk a little bit about the advantages and other considerations in issuing pension bonds.
Yes, thank you, Sarah. Good evening. On this slide, we are covering some of the considerations in favor of considering pension obligation bonds. As Sarah indicated in the Standard & Poor's rating report, there was a discussion of the city's outstanding UIL obligation, and by considering a pension obligation bond, the city could proactively take steps to get ahead and prepay or refinance that obligation. And as Sarah indicated, the goal in doing so would be to lock in an interest cost for the bonds that is significantly lower than the discount rate for CalPERS. So therefore, allowing for potential savings to be created over the life of the bonds. The pension obligation bond debt service profile can be sculpted in many different ways, and Sarah showed you 4 examples. And really those ways are tailored to the public agency specific needs, and also the availability of revenues and funds on hand, in combination with other strategies that are already in place. And I just want to highlight something else that Sarah mentioned earlier, that pension obligation bonds are part of an overall pension cost management strategy. And so that strategy is comprehensive and really includes many tools. And the city already has a pension liability policy in place. It's setting money aside in a Section 115 trust. And so this is just another tool to add to those, and those tools together work in combination to address and tackle the unfunded liability. The potential to lock in attractive borrowing costs could result in significant savings for the city over time. However, unlike a typical refinancing, these savings are projected at the point in time when the pension obligation bonds are issued, and really will be fluctuating over the life of the borrowing. And because they will depend on the way CalPERS performs over that time period. As Sarah said, if CalPERS overperforms, they will earn more on the invested money. And if they underperform, then there is the possibility of a new basis being created. And it's really at the end of the term when we draw the line and we see what the aggregate savings were over the time. And that's why it's important to keep in mind that this tool is applied in combination with still setting funds aside that the city is doing in the Section 115 Trust Fund. Moving on to the next slide, which I already partially covered, but in terms of considerations to be mindful of is that there is a market risk, and again, it will depend on CalPERS's overall investment return over the period of time. And if on average that investment return remains to be higher than the pension borrowing cost, then the city will be ahead and those savings will be locked in. If the opposite is what happens, then savings will be diluted over time. On the flip side of that, if CalPERS consistently overperforms and the investment return is significantly higher than projected, the city could end up by prepaying the accrued liability, unfunded accrued liability. It could end in a superfunded status, which could lead to some challenging public policy decisions down the road. And so that's something really to look out for. As Sarah mentioned earlier, rating agencies look to public agencies and carefully analyze their plans and measures in place to tackle their UILs. And the bonds really take the unfunded accrued liability or the debt that the city currently has and really replaces it with this obligation that the city will have to investors. And the bonds will have typically call protection for 10 years. And so for the first 10 years, the city will have committed to the fixed interest rates on the bonds. And after 10 years, like you would do with a mortgage, very often, if rates are lower at the time, and since you already have a much shorter term remaining for the bonds to be paid off, the city could consider to refinance the bonds for additional savings. And Garden Grove, as I mentioned earlier, already has a pretty solid pension liability policy, and that's something that's absolutely required when an agency considers pension obligation bonds, because if there is no formal policy in place and no commitment from the council and decision makers on how potential savings will be applied, those savings could be lost as opposed to being set aside in the trust fund and or used for other purposes to make sure the city is in a solid fiscal position and prepared to address any fluctuations in the investment performance in the future. With that, I will hand it back over to Sarah to cover the chart on the next slide.
Thank you, Anna. Always risk losing people on this slide, but essentially I want to reiterate some things that Anna described and that I described earlier. What we feel it's important for your consideration is to remember that although pension bonds are a refinancing of debt, you are refinancing the debt that's owed to CalPERS into a new kind of debt owed to public and private investors. It is different than, for example, the refinancing the city undertook in 2020 to refinance its water bonds. In the case of the water bonds, the refunding bond proceeds went to the prior bond owners, and such debt was paid off. The old liability went away. You knew that you could calculate what the savings were at the time the new bonds were sold, because you knew what the debt service was on the old bonds, and you could compare it to the debt service on the new bonds, and the difference was the savings. It was sort of end of story. In the case of the pension bond issue, that money that is raised must be transferred to CalPERS essentially immediately following the closing of the bond issue. CalPERS then takes the money and invests the proceeds. That money would then be applied based on the earnings rate to the future commitments that the city has made to retired and active employees. If CalPERS earns exactly the discount rate on average over the life of the bonds, then the savings would be the savings that we calculated at day one that I'll show you here in another slide or two. That's represented by the chart here or the slide here, the line here on the red, or I'm sorry, on the blue line, which is the bond rate. If CalPERS earns more than the discount rate, then the savings that are actualized will exceed the projected savings. Again, this is over time through the life of the bond issue. Again, if they earn more than 6.8%, the discount rate, then the savings that the city achieves are greater than what we projected. If CalPERS over time earns less than the discount rate, so less than that 6.8%, their current discount rate, then the savings that the city actually achieves will be less than what's projected. It's only the case that if CalPERS earns less than the bond rate, again, that's the red line here. If they earn less than the bond rate over time, so less than what we're estimating right now, 3.5%, then the city would not have achieved savings over this bond issue. So I think the natural question is, how has CalPERS done? What has been their historical earnings rate? So we looked over CalPERS over the last 23 years since 1999. The average earnings that CalPERS achieved is 7.23%. Obviously, within there's been some years of very large negative returns, especially during the Great Recession. And now over the last 10 years, ending with fiscal year 2021, the average earnings rate has been 8.71%. So again, those are above the discount rate. So I think that's what this slide is trying to achieve, but just to keep in mind that the story doesn't end at the time the city sells bonds. It's only at the end of the day that we'll be able to evaluate whether the issuance of bonds was a good idea. And again, why we focus very much on the interest rate environment we are in is because so long as the average earnings rate achieved by CalPERS is greater than the bond rate, then there will be savings achieved by the city. Again, this is the current amortization debt service schedule that CalPERS has prepared for the city. It aggregates to $592 million over the next 23 years. So we're going to combine it here with some hypothetical structures mirroring the structures that we talked about earlier, kind of two bookends. One is the structure that we described for Whittier and is probably the most utilized structure among the cities and counties in California that have sold pension bonds in the last couple of years. Here, we call it a modified level structure. We're levelizing the payments that would be made up until the point where they decline. And then we create a declining debt service, pension bond debt service schedule equal to the payments that would be made to CalPERS, you know, had the city not done the financing. You know, we've estimated that the cost of the pension bond payments amount to about $461 million, which compares to gross payments, as I mentioned earlier, that are in the UAL amortization schedule of about $592 million. So gross savings of around $130 million. Present valuing those dollars back, we show that about a little over 100 million, or about 30% of the 329 million that is owed. The second structure is the Corona, the structure we described with the city of Corona, which was an accelerated approach. You know, here they took their, like Corona, the idea would be to take the savings in terms of a shortening the payment time period. So in this case, the payments would be made through 2035. So you know, small amount of savings from the current year through 2035, minimal savings there. Where the savings really are achieved is in year 2036 through 2045, where the city would not have a pension payment to be made besides the normal cost. Again, this achieves a large gross dollar savings, which we show as around $192 million, present valuing those dollar savings back. The amount is $121 million, or roughly just shy of 37% of the $329 million. And there's all sorts of different structures that can be evaluated and, you know, would be evaluated as part of moving forward if the city chooses to do this. These are just two bookends to show those two approaches and how, you know, how that would look with the city's UAL amortization. And again, as we always put in quotes, the savings, that savings is the savings if the city were to achieve interest earnings over time that equals the discount rate. So last slide, and then we'll stop. And this last slide is really focused on the procedure that is required to get to a pension issuance. And for this, I was going to introduce Brian Forbath again from the Stradlane Law Firm to talk about why the validation is required and what's involved in that process.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Thank you all for the pleasure of being with you this evening. So I think most of you all are familiar that, you know, that cities are subject to the constitutional debt limit in California. The constitutional debt limit essentially says that no city, county, or school district shall incur any indebtedness or liability in any manner for any purpose exceeding in any year the income and revenue provided for such year without the assent of 2/3 of the qualified electors of the city. there's certain exceptions to the California to the constitutional debt limit that are widely used throughout the state. One of them is the lease exception or contingent liability that to issue lease revenue bonds, which the city's issued in the past and used before. Another exception to that is an obligation that's imposed by law. And so the legal theory behind pension obligations bonds is that the obligation that the city entered into when it signed the PERS contract and state obligations under the state statutes to fund a pension under the PERS program is an obligation that's imposed by law. And then if that is an obligation imposed by law, it is subject to be refunded underneath what we call the refunding bond law in California. Now, unfortunately, there's no direct case law on point on this topic. And so councils throughout the state have traditionally advised their clients that in order to give a legal opinion as to the enforceability of pension obligation bonds, we need to seek what we call a judicial validation proceeding. Judicial validation proceeding is the specific procedures that are laid out under state statutes that essentially allows the city to essentially sort of sue itself in public. What we call an in rem proceeding, where the court will get jurisdiction over the subject matter of the litigation by allowing the city to publish a summons. And this summons goes out to the world and says, hey, we're going to issue these pension obligation bonds. We believe that this obligation underneath the PERS contract is an obligation that's imposed by law, and that we, the city, have a right to refund that obligation pursuant to the refunding bond law. And we seek a judicial seek a judicial judgment to that effect. So the summons is provided by the city. It would get published in a court it gets published in newspapers for once a week for 3 straight weeks. And at the end of that 10-day period, so anybody has the opportunity. Nobody responds at that point in time, then the city moves forward with what we call a default judgment. And at that point in time, once a default judgment is entered, then we have a valid judgment that says that the city's authorized to issue those bonds. So the initial step in order to do all of that is the city actually has to make the situation right. It has to adopt a resolution authorizing the issuance of pension obligation bonds and authorizing the filing of the judicial validation action. And so that would be the first step that the city council would be asked to take if you decide to pursue this financing option to help alleviate some of the pension concerns. As it's laid out on the slide, it is a lengthy process. The court proceedings, especially with COVID, could take a little while to get through the courts. We're estimating it could be anywhere from 12 to 15 weeks. Recent actions we've taken have been about 3 to 4 months to get this done in Orange County and LA County Superior Courts. And once you get the judgment entered, we would validate not only the issuance of these pension obligation bonds, but also the ability of the city to issue pension obligation bonds in the future. The judgment would validate the ability to issue bonds to refund future unfunded liabilities. So that's essentially the process that would go through. Sarah, back to you, or to Anna.
I actually have a question for Brian, if I'm able.
Yeah, no, please.
Yeah, this is Councilmember Brightingham. Using the same thought process that you just outlined for obtaining the bonds, couldn't you use that same thought process? Because the state is also, we entered into a contract with the state through PERS. Aren't they obligated the same? I mean, don't they have the same obligations? And, my thought is, I don't know if they're shielded from lawsuits in this regard or this type of thing, but their gross mismanagement of PERS over the last 20 years has largely contributed to this unfunded liability on all cities. So instead of going after our taxpayers, shouldn't we be going after the state? I mean, they literally raided the fund in '96 to pay for midnight basketball for gang members In 2005, they raided the pension fund to pay for hypodermic syringes for drug addicts. And then they pay it back with a standard interest rate, and it loses its compounding factor. It loses all the other applications that it would have grown. And it really created this huge pension. And to this day, they still raid that fund routinely, to the point that I think it's only 19% funded last I looked.
Are you talking about the CalSTRS? Is that what you're talking? Yeah.
Well, the CalPERS, CalSTRS, even the teachers. I mean, they raid these pension funds routinely. And so if we're using that same logic that you just laid out, couldn't we go after the state for this same issue?
Yeah, I don't, in order to sue somebody, right, you've got to have a valid cause of action. And I'm not sure what the council member, Riddick, I'm not sure the cause of action that, City of Garden Grove would have in order to sue the state for past grievances here.
$300 million in unfunded liability. That's a pretty big cause of action, I think, that they directly caused. It's very provable. The state, through gross mismanagement of the PERS system and constant raiding of the fund, I think it's really easy to prove, actually.
I mean, we'd be happy to look into that for you, but I would just caution that I don't think any other cities or anybody else has sort of pursued that as a legal cause of action. And
hence, there's no case law.
Well, I don't know, there's case law, and then obviously the facts would have to support all the allegations that you made. And I'm not saying that they don't, but we'd have to sort of. The one other thing that I forgot to add in my discussion is that the authorization of the pension obligation bonds is really the initial step in the process. The council, although you are legally authorizing the issuance of the bonds, we would have to come back to the city council at a second time to approve the offering documents for the bonds. And at that point in time, the council really would have the full discretion to decide whether they want to move forward with the issuance of the bonds or not at that point in time, based on where the market is and unfunded liabilities.
Brian, and once the validation action is completed, it's good forever, and it doesn't obligate the city to pursue the bonds if they decide not to, right?
Correct. There's no obligation to actually issue the bonds. It's the initial step. It's a required step, and it's the initial step in the process, but there's no obligation to move forward with them.
Thank you.
I think that's it for our presentation. Unless Sarah, you had anything else?
Yeah, no, thank you, Brian. The only one element that I feel I'd be remiss to not at least put out there is that obviously there are a lot of influences right now that are moving the financial markets in different directions. We spent the first, really going back to the last quarter of 2021 and here continuing in the first 2 months of 2022 focused domestically on inflation and an expectation that the Federal Reserve will be increasing interest rates as early as their March meeting, which is 2 weeks away. We now have the geopolitical concerns, challenges with the conflict in Ukraine that are moving the financial markets the other way, with a flight to safety purchasing of treasury rates. So there is a lot of competing forces in the financial markets. We can't lock anchor on a bond rate until we get to the pricing, which can't happen until all these other activities, as Brian mentioned, the passing of an authorizing resolution, and then following it, the validation procedure. We can't lock in interest rates until all of that happens. So certainly part of the discussion that we'd be coming back to council with is updates on the financial markets. Quite honestly, if it, you know, if for some reason markets move, you know, to the point where you're at, you know, a 5 or 6% borrowing rate, well, then that changes the whole savings equation. So not to say that we're in a race against time, but it is something that is very dynamic. And I know we've spent a lot of time as just, you know, very of us consultants kind of, you know, worrying about and contemplating and evaluating different structures that achieve the best borrowing costs for different issuers in their goals. So that was the last thing that I wanted to mention. Didn't have a slide on that per se, but I think it's worth, you know, acknowledging the environment that we're in right now. That.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Thank you all for the patience with us for a pretty lengthy presentation. I feel very excited, but I don't, I'm not sure if everyone feels the same feeling. It's a lot of numbers we're talking about. But here are a couple of takeaway notes. One is that regardless how we got to the current point of 300 million plus unfunded pension liabilities, that is a legitimate debt that we have as a city, and it's a contract. We are contractually obligated to pay it. So issuing the pension obligation bonds will help to reduce the cost of paying off this very expensive debt. Delaying it would only snowballing the issue. Based on the structure that Sarah has shared with us, we are estimating the savings, above 100 million over the life of the bonds. Could be bigger based on what structure we decide. So that's number one. And number two, it's that the unfunded actuarial liability is being refunded through a pension obligation bonds, but it's only refunding the current unfunded actuarial liability. In other words, that it could come back because regardless we have a pension obligation bonds or not, it's depending on based on CalPERS performance, contractual term changes, and all the other factors that it's not controlled by us. So I want to bring that to everyone's attention as well, so you have the full information to evaluate. And with that, I'll turn it over to Scott.
Yeah, thank you, Patricia. I see Councilmember O'Neill's hand is raised, and that concludes our presentation. So I know Sarah, Anna, Patricia, Brian, everybody's available for any questions or council members at this point, of course. And then we can, after there's any questions, we can certainly mention a few steps that we're thinking of moving forward with, but want to open it up for questions and maybe begin with Councilmember O'Neill, whose hand is raised.
Thank you, Scott. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you fine.
Okay, great. Yeah, I just wanted to dig a little deeper on one issue that I will have questions from my constituents. So I see everyone that's on this call. We all understand the situation pretty well, depending on where you're sitting. We understand that refinancing our debt is a good thing. We're going to save the money for the city. What I have a problem with, and maybe someone can answer this a little for me, is when a constituent comes to me and says, hey, we got these bonds, we got $329 million. We paid off the unfunded liability, but if CalPERS doesn't invest it properly, we don't really get the payoff that we originally were told. Why doesn't it just pay off the unfunded liability and we start from scratch and move forward? It's still based on how they finance, how they invest that money. Can someone expand on that a little bit?
Sarah, do you want to take that question?
Sure, I'll start. I think in part, I find maybe not adequately understood is that that $329 million is calculated based on an expectation that that CalPERS would earn a certain interest rate through some period of time, in this case, 2044, 2045. So it's not a gross funded liability. That's not the gross dollar amount of the benefits that are already promised to active and prior employees. It's the net dollar amount that assumes that CalPERS earns a certain interest rate. So it's a little different than the other kinds of debt.
Well, sorry to interrupt you. That does help me explain that to a constituent or someone else. And you know, I'm all for saving money any way we can, and we're stuck with this. And anytime anybody questions me on pension liability, I'm like, hey, we employ members that are part of CalPERS. Go talk to the CalPERS board or the governor or whoever you want to talk to. But I'm obligated to this city. We're obligated to these people forever until they're deceased, and they've earned a pension credit. And I'm all about, you know, people that have earned a credit deserve a credit. So yeah, I'm kind of, you know, in favor of this. And Sarah, thank you so much for the presentation. You don't have to ever apologize for a little one in around there. So no problem at all. So thanks, I'm done. Thanks.
Mayor?
Go ahead. Was that George?
Yeah.
Yeah, please go ahead.
So, yeah, I'm kind of like with John on this. I think, you know, it's a mess, and now we're taxed with fixing the mess. And, you know, it does save money. My biggest concern, though, is that we're looking at bonds as the only application. And, you know, I would like a little, maybe a light dive into other venues that could possibly be used. Again, like my idea, you know, let's do the state. I mean, is that even doable? If it's not, then great. But I would like to know what the other options are. I get this specific meeting is for bonds, but, you know, I'd like to know what other options we have. And if they're feasible or not. You know, if Omar and his folks say, hey, no, it ain't gonna happen, there's no way possible, we'd lose, okay, fine. But I'd like to know that, because quite frankly, I do fault the state largely for creating this mess, and as do many people. And I think it's very provable. I don't know if they're shielded from liability. I don't know if you know, other cities haven't taken the action, but you know, I'm not opposed to the bond. I do think it saves money over time. It should anyway, theoretically. Like, you know, there are some risks there, but yeah, I'd like to see all the options, not just one. Bonds. What are our options, and what are the other feasible ways of dealing with this?
Thanks, George. Any others?
Hey, Steve, John O'Neill again, real quick.
Go ahead.
Real quick, just so everybody knows, moving forward, you know, by Garden Grove going to the OCFA, you know, we have a projected unfunded liability of 0 by 2026 for our fire department. So what would have been about a 1/3, you know, drag as far as CalPERS goes, at least we could point to that and say, hey, we went this direction. They got an unfunded liability that's going down. You know, we're trying to do things. We're getting better service to our constituents, and we made a move here. But barring, you know, diminishing services to constituents, you know, we're stuck in this CalPERS boat with everybody else. So we're all floating down the river together. So thanks.
Yep. Thanks, John. Anybody else want to weigh in? I'd just like to thank everybody involved for all your diligence on this. I know it took it was heavy lift just to get our credit ratings up, and that's a really big deal. And that opens the door for this mechanism to be so fruitful in terms of the savings potential. So that was a great first step. And now here we are in a very rapidly rising interest rate environment. So I think this is great. I think it's prudent for us to proceed expeditiously towards getting this done before rates go up too much more. Where do we go from there, Scott? You're not looking for any action tonight. Any other comments, or where do we take this?
No, there no further comments from our end, Mr. Mayor. If there's no other questions, I think as a staff, what we are normally planning to do is bring to you at our next council meeting, we'd bring to you this resolution to begin the validation process. And as you've heard our bond counsel say, that does not, approving that does not obligate us to issue any bonds or do anything. It just starts the judicial validation process. And like you heard him say, it's probably will take 3 to 4 months. We have to watch the bond market interest rates, everything else going on. We have to complete the process. And then when it's all done, we would come back to council a second time and say, hey, we're still thinking about doing this. And come back to you for your approval. Like I said, it's quite a process we've got to go through. We got more work to do, but we'd probably bring a resolution for your consideration at the next meeting. And then again, that just gives us more work to do. So that's what I would anticipate doing.
All right, great. I would say proceed with diligence and let's get it done as quickly as possible.
Excuse me, Mr. Mayor, this is Liz here at the council chamber.
Yeah, go ahead.
To see if you would allow, we have Mr. Malley that does have a question, if you would allow that, or have him contact the finance department directly for any further questions. I'm going to give some direction on that.
Sure, I'm happy to allow him to speak. I appreciate that he would come out and be engaged and interested in a sort of an off topic like this. So please go ahead.
Mr. Mayor, City Council, I just had a very simple question, and I'm sure would go to the finance director. How will these bonds be paid off? Will it be through an ad valorem tax on property? Where does the money come from? Whose pocket?
Great question, if I may answer that. These bond debt service payment, it's nothing in addition to what we are budgeting and paying right now directly to CalPERS. Instead, it's paying to the investors who purchase the bonds. And as a matter of fact, we're projecting the payment that we're going to be paying to the investors are going to be much lower than the amount we're paying to CalPERS, depending on what financing structure we're going to handle with the issuance of the bonds. It is all through a regular normal budget process on a biannual basis, and it's all part of the operating budget for the city. The revenue or the sources came from different revenues and fees and all the other means that runs for city government. It is considered a part of normal operating cost, part of the personnel cost to run a city government.
But you passed Measure O, it's 20 million, 25 million. Is that going to come out? Is there a new source of funds that's going to be levied on any Garden Grove homeowner to pay these bonds?
No, there will be no additional tax levies due to the issuance of the bonds.
Fees, parcel tax, whatever they call it,
No.
Lawyers have worked really hard to get around Prop 13, 62, 218. So I'm just saying that, because I know 218, you cannot levy against property. It would be hard. This is why probably this lease bond agreement that could be one way that the lawyers have figured out to get around. So anyway, that was my question. Thank you so much. I just wanted to make sure there's no more fees, levies, or anything against the citizens of Garden Grove. This will come out of the budget you planned for already.
That is correct.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Mr. Mayor, thanks for letting me speak up. Appreciate it.
You got it. Okay, any others wishing to comment before we wrap this up?
Mr. Mayor, I will mention that, following tonight's presentation, we'll add this presentation up on our website so people can see it and go over it. And as always, as a staff, we're available to questions from the public. I know Mr. Malley, I've talked to him before, and happy to chat with him some more too, if it's helpful. These are all, it's a complex subject, and we want to spend time answering as many questions as we can. So just wanted to mention that.
Great, thanks for that, Scott. Okay, thank you everyone for attending on this special meeting to discuss a very important topic that has very exciting possibilities for huge savings for the city if we can play it out and get it done. So thank you everyone, and we look forward to seeing this come back at some point in the future. I guess it'll be several months down the line. It's the next time we'll see it.
Mr.
Right.
Yeah, you'll actually see probably something at our next council meeting, but then that's just to kind of take a step forward. But then we have a lot of work to do after that.
Got it. Okay, so the formal action item will come soon, and then there's the several months of diligence to get it done. Okay.
Right.
All righty. Thank you everyone for attending. We'll go ahead and wrap it up at this point. And please take care and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank
Good night.
you.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.
Of course, have a good night.
Okay, you guys.
All right.